question. I think we have a question that was texted in. Jeremy?
Yes. The question that was texted in to us is, what is the New Jerusalem? What is the New Jerusalem? Again, this is one of those questions that I really appreciate because it is obviously based in Scripture. It is asking questions about what Scripture has to say. And whenever we come across those types of questions, it just makes it so much easier. When we start with what human beings are doing sometimes, maybe we can easily get at Scripture. We have to kind of move through a bunch of misinformation. But when you're asking a question that comes straight from Scripture, it just makes it so much easier. So what is the New Jerusalem? The actual phrase New Jerusalem only shows up a couple of times in Scripture, and it shows up in Revelation. So let's go ahead and look at the two passages in Revelation where the actual phrase shows up as is. Now, I want to say that this is not the definitive, but it is important to understand what the context is. In Revelation chapters 2 and 3, Jesus is writing letters to the churches of Asia. He is helping them understand what they need to do so that they can be a part of the kingdom and not have their lampstand removed. He says good things about what they're doing, and he charges them to change some things. But in all of those, there's also these promises about being with him forever if they will do what he says. And so through every one of these, he has a different figure for talking about being a part of his eternal kingdom. That is the church, which is also his kingdom in eternity in heaven. So is it talking about the church or is it talking about eternity? Well, the answer is kind of yes. So if you look in chapter 2, verse 7, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Well, that's obviously a reference to not only being a part of his church, but also a part of the eternal kingdom. And he says the same thing in chapter 2, verse 11, or something similar to that. Verse 17 has this promise. So all of these letters to the churches have promises about how to be a part of his eternal kingdom. But the particular one we're going to focus on is in chapter 2, going on, let's start in verse 11. And talking to the congregation in Philadelphia, not Pennsylvania, but Philadelphia in Asia Minor, he says, I am coming quickly. Hold fast to what you have so that no one will take your crown. Of course, that crown is the crown of winning at the games. And so it has this idea of overcoming and being successful in something difficult. And he says in verse 12, he who overcomes, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it any more. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from God, and my new name. So here it talks about, he was near, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches in verse 13. So it's really to all saints. Now, a few things that we can observe in this is that he is talking about those people who will be obedient to his warnings and listen to what he says, and they can be a part of his kingdom, not only the church, but also the eternal kingdom, which is in heaven. And so the New Jerusalem from this passage we can see is talking about both the church and this eternal relationship with Jesus that comes by being his people. But we do see that same phrase showing up toward the end of this same book of Revelation when he talks about how to describe this, not only this church, but also the eternal version of it that will be after all the bad things happen and after eternity has taken place. He says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And he says, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them. They shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he talks about other kind of promises. Now, all of this figurative language comes from the Old Testament. New heavens and new earth comes from Isaiah chapter 65 and 66. The idea of the New Jerusalem, we're going to see, has other places. This idea of there's no longer any sea. He's talking about the fact that his people won't be surrounded by enemies anymore. It talks about this bride adorned for her husband, which is another reference to the church and also the eternal relationship we're able to have with him. And so all of these pictures are not only Old Testament pictures, but they're New Testament pictures as well. And they describe not only the church, but this eternal relationship that we're able to have with Jesus. So the New Jerusalem in Revelation both talks about the church that is loyal to him and listens to him and is obedient, but is also able to take hold of this eternal relationship. And we can see language like this show up in Hebrews chapter 12 as well. In Hebrews chapter 12, when he's talking to the saints there, he talks about what they have come to, what they have left, and what they don't need to try to go back to. He says, in verse 18, "For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which was such that those who heard them begged that no further word would be spoken to them, for they could not bear the command. Even if a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling." So he says, you have not come to Sinai, the mountain where God had delivered the law to the people. It's not like you are Israel all over again. You have a different function. You have a different place, and we have a different relationship with God. This is not based on separation. It's about closeness. Now notice what he says. He says, "But you have come," in verse 22, "to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator of a new covenant, the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel." It's important for us to see that all of these pictures are being used that come from the Old Testament that talk about the relationship that we have with God through Christ, and how all of those promises that he had made to his people, they come true. They are fulfilled in the church. We're not waiting for something else. Our friends and neighbors who are thinking about, an eternal kingdom on this earth misunderstand passages like this. They're thinking about actual physical Jerusalem. He's not talking about an actual physical Jerusalem. He's talking about something else. And it's not physical. And he goes on to say he's going to be shaking the things which can be shaken so there can be an eternal relationship toward the end of this chapter. He's talking about this eternal relationship that's not physical. We are on this earth, but the relationship we have with him is spiritual and eternal. One last passage I would think about when we're thinking about what kind of promises these things are. If you go back and even look at Isaiah chapter 2, right after he talks about the damage that the people had done to their relationship with God through their disobedience and the punishment that he was going to bring on the physical city, he starts to promise that he's going to provide something that's not physical for them, an eternal relationship that's going to be different than the old covenant. Starting in verse 2, it says, "Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples, and will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Come, house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." So the promises that were all over the Old Testament about this eternal relationship that God was going to establish, he uses these pictures. And then the New Testament picks up on those pictures and continues to fill them out so that we can better understand what this relationship is that God had wanted with his people. I certainly hope that answers your question. This is a personal interest of mine, and I'm glad that you asked the question. I'm glad that we get to talk about these things. A lot of people want to focus only on heaven, but I don't think they understand that the church is really the fulfillment of all of those promises. We're not waiting for the kingdom. We're able to be a part of it now.